Hey there, it's Chris from Good Roads. In the last video, I made a router template for the freestyle deck that I'm working on, and I finished up the woodworking aspect of that deck build. So in this video, we're gonna add some art to it. This deck is actually the third in a series of decks that I've been iterating on. The first one is actually this deck right here. The second one was that first freestyle deck that I made, and there are some themes and motifs in the designs of those two decks that I really like and that I want to incorporate into this new deck that I'm working on today. But I didn't have a concrete idea of exactly what I wanted the graphic to be, and I knew I wanted to do some experiments, so I just grabbed a whole bunch of materials and got started. This deck was made out of rock maple veneers, and I haven't worked with that wood in a while, so I wanted to do a couple quick tests first with some different materials, different mediums that I'm using to see how they react with the wood and how much the different inks and pigments bleed. I just used a spare piece of veneer for this just to test out some of the stuff I'd be working with. I decided to go with a dual color motif that I've used on a couple different decks, and in the past I've done the white section using paint pens. I really like the semi-transparency of the ink and that the wood grain shows through, but dyeing an entire board that way is more time consuming than I would like it to be. So to try to get the same effect but to do it a little quicker, I experimented with some diluted paints, but I also played around with this white alcohol ink, and the test that I did looked really good, so I decided to go that route with my board. I really like how the ink looks on the wood. It's got that semi-transparent quality, and it's actually a little glossy, which I think looks cool. The ink dried really fast though, and the fact that I used a narrow brush meant that it didn't get laid down perfectly evenly. I used some sandpaper to knock it back this time around, but I think in the future I'll be looking for a different application method that'll get me a more even coat. Next up, I needed to add the color bar, and I'm going to be sticking with the theme of this series of decks so far. We're going orange with this one. And while I was doing this project, I also learned that I have moved to an art-supplied desert. The closest art store is about an hour and a half away, so instead I hit up the hardware store and got a sample can of some indoor paint. House paint has really great pigmentation, but it goes on in pretty thick coats, so I wanted to try thinning it out. First thing I tried was mineral spirits, and the two wouldn't even mix, so that was a no-go. This does not appear to be working. It's not integrating at all. I don't want to use acetone though. I really don't want to use acetone. No, this is a failure. Okay. So next up I tried acetone and God. Well, that's disgusting. It coagulated. That's obviously not what we're looking for either. I imagine actual paint thinner might do the trick, but I didn't have any on hand, so I decided to just go with undiluted paint and do my best to keep it thin and even. And it actually came out looking pretty good. It did. It did come out looking pretty good. I'm pretty happy with how it came out. Could have been a little bit more better. I don't know, we'll see. We'll see. I also want to do a fat smudge of color behind the main graphic, and originally I wanted to use the giant 3D printed graffiti markers I made a while back, but since I wasn't able to thin the paint, I don't think they're going to work in this case. Instead, I took a spare bit of sponge and I cut it into a rough marker nib shape that I thought would work for what I wanted. I loaded up my sponge with paint and made my mark, trying to be very intentional about shape, location, and proportions. While the paint was drying, I got cracking on another experiment that I really wanted to try. I've been following Life Skateboards on Facebook and Instagram. He makes these absolutely gorgeous decks, primarily using linocut and rubber block printmaking techniques for the graphics. I've had the idea of using a 3D printed stamp for graphics bouncing around in my head for a while, and seeing his success with block printed graphics made me want to try it out. So I printed out a stamp of my logo in TPU and got to work cleaning up all the blobs and stringing from the edges of the stamp. I was also interested in getting rid of the texture the 3D printer left behind, so I tried sanding the stamp, and I mean, it worked, but it was going really slow. so I broke out the big guns. And that actually did a pretty good job of getting my stamp surface nice and smooth and even. Since I've never done this before, I wanted to test it out to get some practice. I tried pressing down the stamp with my hands, and I also tried using a brayer, again, following Life's Skateboard's example, and I like the results with the brayer much more. Cool. It's going okay. I gotta get that. Gotta actually push. So I re-inked my stamp and brought it over to the deck. Next up, I wanted to add the main component of the graphic, so I grabbed a slew of black markers, did a quick pencil sketch for proportions, and got drawing. I still think having a popsicle graphic on a popsicle deck is absurd and hilarious, so I'm continuing with that theme from the last deck. I got my rough lines in place using a paint pen, refined them with a chisel tip art marker, and then came in for final details with a fine point Sharpie. When it comes to fine art, sculpture is definitely my medium, and I tend to think of even two-dimensional arts in the same way that you would think of a three-dimensional one, where you're adding and removing material. I treat my line work the same way. I'll start by roughing out my lines, and then I'll go in and sculpt them into the shapes that I want. For me, it's easier and much more reliable than trying to get them right all at once. My hand's not steady enough, my line work isn't strong enough, and to be honest, my brain just kinda doesn't work that way. It takes me multiple passes. But with some patience and attention to detail, I can usually sculpt the line that I envision in my head. Once the ink had dried, all that was left was to add a protective layer of poly, and the deck was done. And here it is. I think this one's gonna be called King Creamsicle. And I was so excited about getting to ride this thing, getting to learn some new tricks, getting to shoot some footage and show you guys how it works. But there's a problem. That DLAM issue that I talked about in the last video, it was way worse than I thought it was. After a bit of warm-up riding and starting to put the deck through its paces, I could hear it creaking and I could feel the deck getting softer, which meant my layers were coming apart. And now I can almost riffle the veneers like a pack of cards. There just wasn't enough glue, which sucks. I was really looking forward to this thing. I wanted to learn Caspers, and then I wanted to learn Braille to Caspers. Put a lot of work into the deck, and I'm bummed that it's not gonna be rideable. I don't wanna break it, so I think this one's gonna end up just being a wall hanger. And that means I'm just gonna have to take my own advice and go and make the next one better, which, because I made the router template, because I have a good set of molds, should be pretty easy to do. I do want to say that before I got a little worried about breaking the board, I had a lot of fun riding it. The shape's great, the geometry's great. The difference between the maple and the birch on the deck is like night and day. It really makes a huge difference. And I still want the deck that I had planned to build. I liked the way it felt, so I want to be sure to go and make the next version one that will stand up to all the abuse that I want to put it through, one that I can get a lot of mileage out of and really enjoy. So I am going to be coming back to this because, I mean, I want a skateboard, that's why. Now, in order to make use of that template, I do need to build a router table. So in the meantime, we're gonna be switching gears a little bit. I've got a ton of other projects that I'm working on that I can share with you guys. So if you haven't already, subscribe to see those, subscribe to see the finished version of this deck when I get back to it. If you've got any questions or comments, leave them down below. As always, I'm grateful that you guys come along with me for the journey. And until next time, I'll see you soon. So one of the other projects that I've been working on is a set of custom bushings, like a whole run. And I was testing them out in here, and I just picked up the board and realized that one of the bushings just exploded, just shattered. Which means I can't use them, I can't sell them. I don't know what I'm gonna do with that content. Yeah, there's some updates that need to happen here on the channel. I gotta get out of the basement I'm in. It's too humid and too cold. I need a workspace where the humidity is not gonna affect my laminations, and I need a workspace where the temperature is not gonna affect my cures for both epoxy resin for composites and urethane for wheels and bushings. And I don't know, maybe that video becomes a review of that urethane because it just sucked to work with. So, a lot of failures happening on the channel right now. And we'll get through it, but like, you know, maybe I switch gears and just do something fun. Either way, I appreciate you guys. I'll see you soon.